Hey guys, I'm Cameron and this is Modern Marriage. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about how the personal development movement, particularly for people to focus on themselves in their 20s, is really impacting the dating culture. There seems to be this growing number of voices on the internet in particular, especially men, who will say that young people need to go out there and really develop themselves, get in good physical shape, take care of their mental health, get a good job, dress well, and look the part before taking dating seriously or before trying to find their future spouse. Because chances are, if you look more presentable and if you have your life together, you're going to attract a better partner, which is true. But then on the other side of the aisle, there are people who are really tired of this obsession with self-development and think that, isn't true love supposed to be about finding somebody who likes me for me, not somebody who only likes me if I come across as this perfect manicured person, which is also true. But what I think both of these sides are really missing is the fact that this overemphasis on personal development when it comes to preparing for dating is that it actually is fostering what seems like a lot of fear in many people that they just aren't good enough to go out there and try to meet someone, that if they're not good enough for marriage, then they're certainly not good enough to become a parent and to have kids of their own. And it's growing this sense of fear, particularly in young people in their 20s and even early 30s, that they have to become the perfect version of themselves before they have any chance of making marriage work or any chance of making parenting work. And what fostering this sense of fear does is that it actually robs us of the opportunity to experience what, for the majority of people, will be the best opportunity for self-development that exists. And that is getting married and having kids. So I want to show you guys an example of what I mean by this. So I was watching this clip of Chris Williamson. He hosts the wonderful podcast Modern Wisdom, and he was talking about what it's like to be unmarried and 36 in response to a question that he got from one of his audience members. And I think his answer really summarizes well today's approach to personal development and dating and feeling like we really have to get all of our ducks in a row before we get serious about finding our spouse and about becoming parents.
Do I feel sad about being 36 and unmarried or without a life partner? Don't you want children? I can't wait to be a dad. I really do want children. The more that I think about it, the more that I spend time around them. A lot of my friends have had kids recently or are pregnant or whatever at the moment. And I'm fired up for it. But I focused on different things when I was young, and I focused on different things when I'm slightly less young as well. And I hope I don't look back and regret it. I don't think that I'm going to. I'm intent on building a family that I'm really going to love. But look, you can't do everything at once. And I've hopefully done things that set up the future family that I create to be well positioned, materially, emotionally. Holy shit. Even, 3 years ago, if I look at the person I was, forget all of the objective metrics of everything, just the subjective way that I showed up and what I knew about myself. And I've made a big difference. And I don't know whether I would have been able to do that whilst learning to swim or fly with a family at the same time. Different people on different timelines.
So I will say that I love Chris's podcast. I think his work is great, but this clip definitely caught my attention because I think it's a great representation of our overfixation today in our 20s and even into our 30s on becoming this really great version of ourselves before getting married and before having kids. So while there's nothing wrong with wanting to become a better version of you, especially if it's towards the end of finding a great spouse, the reason that self-development can conflict oftentimes with the goal of starting a family is in the title. It's self-development. It's focused on the self. And if we're too focused on ourselves, a lot of the times that can actually impede our ability to meet someone great and become a person who's worth marrying and someone who could be a great parent one day. Because marriage and parenting are inherently really selfless vocations. They are about living for other people. And if we spend all of our 20s and a lot of our 30s focused solely on becoming this person who we really like and someone that we can show off to other people, then that's all about us. It's all about us doing the things we want to do or the things that we think are right for us. And we never practice prioritizing other people in the way that you have to once you have a family. So not only has the personal development movement largely pushed people towards a focus on themselves instead of a focus on other people, which is not helpful when it comes to preparing for marriage, it's also encouraged a sense of fear in people that they're never actually going to be ready to get married and definitely never to have kids. And a lot of people believe that today. A lot of people have a fear that no matter what they do, their marriage will end. No matter what they do, their kids are going to grow up and they're not going to turn out well because of a lack in their ability as parents. And that's a really terrifying thought. It's really terrifying to think that a marriage you commit to for life will end one day, or that you won't be able to parent your children as good as they deserve. Especially when society is constantly telling you that you have to become this superhuman version of yourself before you'll be ready to take on either of those challenges. When in reality, no one is ever actually ready for marriage, and no one is definitely ever ready for parenting. And the reason for that is there's really nothing you can do in life that prepares you for marriage and parenting the way that getting married and becoming a parent will. That you actually just have to get married, you have to take that leap of faith, and you have to have a kid in order to know how to be married and how to parent. That these jobs, these vocations of spouse and parent are incredibly learn on the job vocations. They are not like any other job in that you literally cannot study enough to be good at them. You can't prepare yourself to a point for marriage or parenting where you're not going to make any mistakes, where you're not going to do something that you regret or say something you regret, or really just mess up every day in small ways or even big ways. So as much as people who are really big into self-improvement and staying single in your 20s and focusing on yourself really like to emphasize having a great career and making a lot of money and becoming really physically fit and taking care of your mental health, all things that aren't necessarily bad, but they're also things that aren't actually going to make you a better spouse or a better parent in and of themselves. Obviously, being able to provide for your family financially is really important, especially if you're going to be the spouse expected to do that. But outside of being able to provide financial stability, being successful in your career takes many different skills than being successful in marriage or parenting. Staying in good physical shape is very different than raising an infant. These skill sets and these areas don't necessarily overlap enough to justify pushing off marriage until you are able to accomplish other things, at least if your eventual goal is family. Of course, there are reasons outside of fear or this compulsion to over prepare for dating that people will push off marriage or they'll push off having kids. And some people don't want to get married and they don't want to have kids, and that's fine. But for people who feel like this emphasis on personal development might be holding them back actually in their dating life or in their plans for having a family one day, then the rest of this video is for you. So first, let's talk about the benefits of getting married younger, taking that plunge, and then I'll get into the absolute bare necessities you need before you get married. First off, if you get married younger, you actually get a chance to develop into yourself, to grow into yourself with another person. So that person becomes part of your identity in a much more impactful way because you two are spending a developmental period of your lives together that is really transformative. So the 20s are an incredible time for people that they often will graduate college or they'll finish school and they'll get their first jobs and they'll experience things in the world for the first time. And you only get those things once. You only get to do those firsts once. And if you get to share that with another person because you two are married and you've committed to this life together, that person becomes a part of your story. They become a part of your history, and you have that shared commonality that is just so incredible for forming the foundation for the rest of your lives together. Not to mention, you just get more time together. I've never met spouses who say they wished they'd met each other later, but I often meet people who say they wished they'd met their spouse younger. For example, if I could have the same relationship with my husband that I do now and have met him 2-3 years earlier, I would have preferred that. I would have made a lot fewer dating mistakes. I would have avoided a lot of heartache. And I would have just had more of my life and my experiences to share with him. And I would have gotten to experience the things that he was going through in his life before we met each other. Next, you will immediately bond with other couples who are getting married younger, or even if they're a little bit older than you and they're married. It is a really special thing to become friends with couples who are married, because you have immediately in common this lifelong commitment that you've made to another person. And it's just cool to have built into your community a network of people that you can go on double dates with and share your marriage trials and triumphs with, and go through this adventure of life together. And that becomes even more significant when you become a parent. So meeting people out in the community who have kids around your age, it just becomes a really cool opportunity to share that life-changing experience with another person, because they, more than anyone, get what you're going through. And there are enough people with kids everywhere that as soon as you start having kids, you're going to immediately notice how many more people in your community are having kids at the same time as you, and you get to bond over all of the things that you guys are going through together. Next, if you're getting married younger, that means you're much more likely to be dating on evidence of potential rather than evidence of actuality. And by that, I mean, when you're young, you have a lot of potential to go in any direction. And it's easier to acknowledge in each other that you do have potential and can become someone truly incredible, particularly with the right support. Which, by the way, if you get married to a good person, you guys can provide that support for each other to realize your potential. But the older you get, the longer you wait to get married, people will look less at your potential and they'll look more at what you've actually already done with your life. And sometimes that can be really difficult. It can be difficult to be judged based on your past. A lot of people would much rather be judged based on partially their present and who they could become in the future. So it's much easier to do, for example, if you're dating someone and you're 21 than if you're 35. Next, if you're getting married younger, chances are you're going to have a lot less pressure on the timeline of when you have children. And I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, because a lot of people believe that couples who get married younger automatically are going to have kids younger, but that's not necessarily the case. And the reason for that is the biggest hurdle to having kids on the timeline you want is to meet your spouse. Obviously, you need to have your spouse in order to create a child together. And so if you've already solved that big puzzle piece question mark, and you found your spouse, now you guys can take the time to really think intentionally about what timeline for having kids, how many kids, how spaced you want them apart, what timeline will be best for your family, as opposed to having to operate under the stress of, a biological clock, which obviously that's more pressing for women. It's really hard to get pregnant basically after 35 for most women. It gets incredibly difficult. But if you have 10, 15 years even before that pressure sets in versus 5 years or even less than that, then you and your spouse get all of that extra time to plan your family in a really intentional way. Okay, 2 more reasons why getting married young is great. The next one is that when you get married, and especially when you have kids, everything you do becomes incredibly meaningful. So obviously, the earlier you get married, and the earlier you have kids, not that you necessarily need to have them young, but if you choose to, the more time you get to spend feeling like your life has a significant amount of meaning. And the reason that I say that is because of all the experiences I've had personally and people I know and have listened to, that something as simple as cleaning the kitchen counters or vacuuming the carpet, you get to, instead of thinking about that as something you have to do to keep your space clean, now it's something you get to do so that you can provide a clean, loving, inviting home for the people you love most in the world. That this actually happened to me earlier this morning. I was vacuuming the carpet and thinking that, when I was in college, I used to hate having to clean the apartment because it was just for my roommates or it was just for me. But now that I'm married to my husband and we have kids, I get to view those daily small activities as a blessing because I get to do them for someone else who I love incredibly. And that's really cool. That's one of the unexpected benefits that, I never saw coming, but has been so wonderful since having a family. And lastly, the best way to personal development, ironically, is actually getting married and having kids. And the reason for that is, I mentioned this earlier in the video, you have to be selfless. As soon as you get married, you're living for someone else. It's not just about you anymore. But then especially when you have kids, someone else all of a sudden needs you so much all the time. And obviously, the older kids get, the less they need their parents constantly. But particularly in that phase of having really young children, your time becomes about not just keeping someone else alive, but giving them the ideal environment to grow up in teaching them what it looks like to be loved and to love. And that is just so good for anybody. It's really good for making us better people in a way that having a great career and even having great friends or doing community service or, getting in shape, none of those things can compare to how much better of a person you can become when you do commit in marriage to someone and you do commit in parenting to your children. Okay, so let's assume at this point that you are bought into the fact that you don't need to become a perfect person before getting married, that maybe getting married younger, if you find someone who you believe you could spend the rest of your life with, that is a viable option. So now let's talk about the things you actually need before you get married to someone. And plot twist, it's not going to be an awesome career. It's not going to be to have the most perfect body or to have an amazing wardrobe or have all of these friends or anything like that. In my opinion, as a marriage therapist, I think there are 5 things you really need to have before getting married, or at least be on your way to having those things. Number 1, you want to find someone who you're physically attracted to and who's attracted to you. Baseline, that's very important for marriage, that part of love is being attracted to each other. That doesn't mean you have to be a supermodel. That doesn't mean you need to marry a supermodel, but you guys want some level of physical attraction. The next one is huge. You want to find somebody who aligns with your values. So someone who sees the world in a similar way to you, believes that a good life looks similar to what you think a good life looks similar to, that your ideas of marriage, of family life, of being a good person, of being moral and virtuous, you guys need to align on what all of those things mean and what they look like in your daily life. This is where being religious or spiritual or having some sort of concrete worldview can be really helpful in dating and even more helpful in marriage, because you have built into your process of dating looking for somebody who has the same value system as you do. The cool thing about religions is that they are a collection of values. They're not just individual values. So when you adopt a religious tradition, for example, I'm Catholic, and so is my husband, that because we're both devout Catholics, we believe very similar things about the world. And obviously, of any religion, there are going to be people who have different views and even different values, but oftentimes those core values overlap significantly more than they would with, the average person you'd meet out on the street. Having similar political views can also help to some degree in this department, but it's less reliable, especially since politics are super divisive right now and often oversimplified. But if you aren't religious, that's okay. You don't have to be in order to find someone, obviously, who shares your values. You just probably need to do a little bit more digging and figure out exactly what you believe, what your worldview is, and how you see the future life that you want to have. Next, you need to find somebody who has compatible life goals with you. That doesn't mean you guys need to have the exact same goals. In some areas, they need to be the same, like whether or not you're going to have kids, when you want to have kids, how much money you need to make in order to fund the lifestyle that you want to have. But outside of that, you can have life goals that aren't identical, but they align well enough that you guys can accomplish them together. So for example, you might be super career driven, which is great. And your spouse doesn't necessarily need to be career driven, but needs to have some goals that would be able to support your ability to focus on your career potentially more than the average person would. Okay, next one. Get comfortable with being frugal. So this is a tough one, I think, particularly today, when it's so easy to get everything we want. With Amazon and Instacart, both of which I love and am a huge fan of, have definitely made it so that it's super easy to get anything that we think of whenever we want it. And when you get married, oftentimes it's ironic, but you spend less. But then when you have kids, you start to spend more. So you need to spend money on your children, which means you need to spend less money on yourself unless your earnings are going to match the increase in cost of having children. So the more frugal you can be comfortable with being, the less pressure you're going to have to make all this extra money before having children. And that's going to give you a lot more flexibility in the timeline of having kids and a lot more flexibility in the sort of job that you and your spouse have and how many hours you guys work. So trying to push yourself, instead of putting all this pressure professionally, push yourself to be comfortable with a more frugal lifestyle can really open up a lot of freedom and flexibility for you and your spouse. And lastly, you'll want to start building a really solid community around you. And if at all possible, stay close to that community when you get married, and then especially when you have kids. So if you have family local to you, or if your family largely lives in the same area, trying to be near them, trying to strengthen your relationship with them, trying to form friendships with people in the community who share your values. Maybe they're also thinking about marriage and they're also trying to have children one day, and just finding people in your life who can support you through what is very difficult. Marriage is hard. Having kids is maybe harder depending on the day, but it's also so incredibly joyful and fulfilling that if you're able to find people in the community to support you in the good times and the bad, then you're only going to elevate those good times, and then you're going to smooth out the tough and difficult times so that they're far more bearable. Okay, guys, that's all I've got for you today. So please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this. And please leave a comment below on this video about your take on the personal development culture and how it's impacting dating and marriage and having kids today. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. I'm Cameron, and this is Modern Marriage. See you guys next week.